Well, we welcome you to our seminar today, Work with Purpose, Pastors and Ministry Leaders Seminar. We are so thankful that you've taken time to come out to be with us today. We have a real treat to be able to hear from Dan Mead, former president and CEO of Verizon Wireless, and Dan Nold, his pastor at Calvary Church in State College, Pennsylvania. They're going to mentor us today on how do we think intentionally about the intersection of faith and work, both from a marketplace leader perspective and from a church leadership perspective. It's a vital conversation. It's one that we at Bethel Seminary care deeply about. So we have something called our Work with Purpose initiative, and I see some familiar faces, some of you who have been out to our events previously. And we're able to engage intentionally in conversations as a seminary and a wider university that welcome students into thinking about this intersection of faith and work and helping people in pastoral ministry leader roles in various sectors think about this as well. If you consider for a moment, we invest well over 100,000 hours of our lives working. The question is, does that investment matter from a Christian perspective? Well, I'm deeply persuaded that it does matter. And I want to wake up in the morning and feel like the contribution that I bring to a majority of my life, my work life, that it matters. And I think you want to know that too. So we're going to get some mentoring today from Dan and Dan on that conversation. Work with Purpose is providing opportunities for seminary students, for business leaders, for those within the wider university context to think about this conversation of faith and work. We're so thrilled that you're here with us today. We're able to do these kinds of events because there are some really generous sponsors that stand with us. One of those is Thrivent Financial, and we're so thankful that Elena is with us today. Thrivent Financial certainly provides financial services, but they are passionate about this conversation of how do we live as whole life individuals, not disintegrated people, integrated people. And we're going to hear a little bit about what Thrivent has to offer and their role in sponsoring this event today. So thank you, Elena, for being with us.
Yep, thank you. Thanks, Justin. Good afternoon. As Justin said, we are just thrilled to be here and supporting this event. The idea of work with purpose is something that is certainly important to us, and so it makes a lot of sense for us to be here. And I wanted to just take a moment to introduce myself and then also the work that we do at Thrivent. So how many folks are familiar with Thrivent in the room? Okay, good, a lot. That's awesome. That's great news. As I said, my name is Elena Beckius, and I'm a managing partner here in the Twin Cities area. We are eastern Minnesota, northwest Wisconsin region of Thrivent. And so I support a team of advisors who serve our members very, very well. And who is Thrivent? So I know many of you know, and we have evolved over the years, but we are just an incredible faith-based financial services organization. And we are pretty large in size. We're a Fortune 500 company, and we're really proud of that. But we're deeply rooted in our communities where we live and where we work, and that's something that we are very, very proud of as well. So what do we do? If you can, I always like to give you guys a little equation here because I was a finance major, not from Bethel, but if you write down a little equation here, the cross plus a dollar sign plus a heart equals a lot of smiley faces. And so that's a little bit about our story, but as I mentioned, we're a faith-based financial services organization, and our mission is to really help our members be wise with money. And we do that through one-on-one comprehensive planning with an individual or a family and an advisor, understanding really what's important to them and putting together a financial plan in place. But much like our peers in the industry, we don't just stop there. It's not about just amassing a ton of wealth. It's what do you do with that wealth? And we really think about money as a tool, and it's money as a tool to serve your family, it's to serve God, it's to serve your community and your church, and it's really about understanding what is your enough, not how much can I accumulate. And so we're really proud of the work that we're doing. we would love to actually connect with each one of you and find out more about the businesses and churches and organizations that you come from. We'd love to have a conversation. We have a table just right outside. When you registered today and got your name tag, you would have had a little piece of paper here that says a variety of different events that are going on. So our invitation with you today is to come meet us. We have a gift for you outside. We have a book that many of you have already picked up. If you haven't, we have more out there. But the book that's in front of you is a more, why am I forgetting the name? Lisa, help me out. Your new money mindset. Thank you. And this is this is a book that was written by our organization's CEO, and just really gives you a nice thought process around what is your money mindset and what do you really want it to be. So please make sure that you grab a gift, and then also check out the piece of paper that has different events that are going on throughout the region in the next couple months. So if you're interested in learning more about Thrivent, stop by one of the education opportunities or stop by us at the booth, and we'd love to have a conversation with you about that. So thanks for having us today.
Yeah, thank you, Elena. And if I could just do a little plug on the resource that Elena mentioned as well. I've read this. It is a tremendous book, and we have a reading group here at the university where we bring seminary students together with business students to have conversations about faith and work. And one of the books that we use is Your New Money Mindset. It's really a compelling argument that Brad Hewitt and his co-author make here about how to view money in light of kingdom perspectives. It's free for you. Go grab a copy. It really is rich. I think it will not only bless you as you think about work with purpose themes, I think it will bless you as you think about your own financial journey for your family as well. I know it has done that for me. So take advantage of that. Ralph Gustafson, come on up here. Ralph is a close friend here in the Bethel community who's worked closely with church partnerships and with the advancement office. Been a friend of Work with Purpose for many years. We've been co-sponsoring events, and very grateful for you and all that you do for our community. And I think you get the privilege of introducing our speakers today.
Thanks, Justin. It is fun for me to be able to introduce these two speakers. First of all, Dan Mead is someone I met about a year ago. Dan is the retired CEO and president of Verizon Wireless, the largest wireless company in the United States, and also the wireless provider for Bethel University. I'm not sure if he knew that, but we're glad for that. He recently retired, as I said, after 37 years. He was one of the founding senior executives of Verizon, and he's been a key part of the company's growth, its financial performance, and its public policy advocacy. He's also held several key positions in the senior parent company. He earned his bachelor's and MBA from Penn State, go Nittany Lions, and he has also been honored by Penn State as their Distinguished Alumnus Award. And that's the highest honor that they give to any of their graduates. He also is good friends with Dan Nold, and I've known Dan longer than that because of our connections through his work as a pastor. Dan has been a pastor of Calvary Church in Pennsylvania for the last 20 years. He has a real heart, and he shared this in the last session, which I think describes him really well. He's not a pastor to the church alone, he's a pastor to the city. He sees God having a calling on him to be a servant of Jesus Christ throughout the city, and he has certainly done that. We're very proud to claim him as one of our Bethel alums. He got his BA degree, his MDiv, and his Doctor of Ministry degree, all from Bethel. And there's just a few of those such special people, and we're glad Dan is one of them. He's also the parent of a number of Bethel students. He is an avid fan of the Minnesota Vikings as well as the Nittany Lions. And what he's known most for in his church is as having the largest collection of sweater vests in the entire world. So if you think you've got a lot, check out Dan's collection sometime. Would you join me in giving them a round of applause for their being with us today?
Thank you, Ralph. It's great to be here. I do have a large amount of sweater vests, but I only wear black or blue. My wife gets really tired of that, but it works for me. I'm going to just do a little bit of preaching, since that's kind of what I enjoy best. But it's only going to be about 10 minutes, and then Dan's going to come up, and we're just going to go kind of back and forth on some questions, and definitely we will open it up to all of you, because we would much rather have this be more conversational and dialogical than monological, if that's the right term. But I do want to, and again, I said this to the group who was gathered for lunch. I don't know that there's going to be anything or a whole lot that's said today that is new to you. I mean, if you're here, you've been reading some of this stuff, you've been having conversations with people, you've been doing some of this stuff. I think one of the greatest values is that when you get together with other people who are doing similar things, and it's not because you talked to them or you wrote a book or somebody else wrote a book, it's really because God has kind of had this on his heart, and all over the country, I would even say all over the world, there's places where he's saying, okay, I want my church to be more involved in this. And so when I come together with groups like this and I hear stuff going on, it just encourages me, because I say, well, that God's doing that. He has a plan, and even though we don't always know what the plan is, we just see our little piece of it. But I do want to set, at least the part of the theology. There's a lot of different parts, but one of the parts of the theology of this intersection between faith and work that has captured my heart the most, and it probably guides me the most in terms of what we do at Calvary. At Calvary, God has given us a vision to build a church without walls, and that was a vision that God gave us. It was one of those experiences I had where it was kind of like God said to me, and I quote kind of thing, probably 15, 16, 17 years ago, and we've kind of been living that out, unpacking that all that time since then at Calvary in a lot of different ways, and I could unpack that, talk about that forever. I love talking about that, but let me simply say today that I think a church without walls understands that it's part of the kingdom of God, and the kingdom of God really knows no boundaries. The church without walls is not a church that has an address. It's not all about the place where we go, but on the other hand, it has millions of addresses. We've started talking a lot at Calvary about the fact that we don't want the front door of the church to be Sunday morning. We want the front door to be your front yard. And maybe for you, that front yard ends up being the place where you work. It definitely ends up being the place where you live. But imagine all of a sudden that the church, not as an address or even as an institution, but the church has millions and millions of front doors. Isn't that really how we got started? I mean, isn't that really our story? And so that kind of drives us. Your front yard, your office, your school, where your kids learn stuff. So let me just take a moment or two and give one verse really that kind of sets the stage for me for this understanding of the inseparable intersection between faith and work. And it's really Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. And I'll focus on verse 10. Ephesians is kind of my personal church blueprint. It's what I've gone to for 2 decades to figure out what does church look like in our setting, and 2:10 is a huge part of that. 8 through 10 says, "For it's by grace that you've been saved through faith. It's not from yourself. It's a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. For we are God's workmanship. We are God's poema." You guys have preached on this of your pastor, where we are, literally it says, we are what God does. We are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance to do. Now, what's Paul saying here? He's saying that you are what God does. Some translations use the word masterpiece instead of workmanship, but the Greek word is just literally, you are what God does. And if we won't do this, but if you just took a moment and leaned into the people next to you and say, what do you do? We understand that question. We would start talking about our vocation. We would start talking about what we do. And if you could lean into God and say, God, what do you do? At least one of his answers, amongst many other responsibilities, would be, I do you. You are what I am doing. And that's just an amazing thing to me. You are what God does. Your heart, your life, what you do is the workmanship of God. And you know that when God does anything, he pours his whole being into it. He did it in the creation of the world. He does it in the continuing creation of our very lives. God has poured and is pouring his whole self into you. That's what Pentecost is all about. I'm going to give you everything that you can take. And he's still doing that. Paul says, for we are his workmanship created in Christ. So what that means, he's sculpting Jesus in our hearts. There is never a moment where God is not in the process of shaping you. Never. I mean, he's just, Paul says it in Romans. You know, everything that you do, everything that happens to you, even I would suggest to you, your sin, God is using that to shape Jesus, to sculpt Jesus in our hearts. And he's going all out. Everything is a creative opportunity, right? Those are not just difficult circumstances you're going through. They are the bold brushstrokes of pain that is unveiling the compassion of Jesus in your heart. And those moments when it seems like he's doing absolutely nothing and all you can do is wait, he's still at work, trying to get you to hold still long enough so that he can put the chisel, you know, in exactly the right spot and reveal the hidden glory of God in your soul. So God has the eye of an artist, and when he looks at you, whether the canvas in your mind seems blank or the sculpture is broken, in his mind the masterpiece is just unfinished. And he looks at you and he sees all that you can be and all that you can do. And in fact, when he looks at us, right, he sees Jesus. And that is an amazing thing. No wonder you are what God does, because when he looks at you, he sees Jesus. I love the verse in the Old Testament that says that he sings over you. I've had those moments, if you have kids, where you've sang a stupid song that doesn't even make any sense over your kids. That's the picture that I get from that. So really the question that we should always be asking ourselves is, where is God at work in me? And where is God at work in you? We use that really to speak hope into each other's life, because there's nobody so broken that God is not willing and able, to work in those amazing ways. But then, when it comes to what we're talking about today, and this really brings us to that intersection between faith and work, Paul is also tell us in Ephesians 2 that it's not just about what God is doing in us, it's about what he wants to do through us. See, with God, there is no huge barrier, dichotomy between being and doing. They're both really, two different sides of the same exact coin. They go hand in hand. We're God's workmanship. God is doing a good work in us so that he can do good works through us. So the real question, and this is the place where, interpretation-wise, I think as pastors we've missed it, and God kind of wants to open our eyes up to a little bit different paradigm. And again, a lot of you are already there, but the question is, what are the good works he has prepared for us? And I think when most people, and probably most pastors, have preached those kinds of passages, and when people who have grown up in church especially are thinking about those kinds of passages, we insert the word good church works. Not good works, just good church works. It's evangelizing and caring for the sick and teaching a Bible study and leading worship, and maybe it extends to something like loving your neighbors, as long as you do it as part of a church program. That benefits your local church. But I believe with all my heart that Ephesians 2:10 envisions all of life as a life that should be lived for the glory of God. You get the same exact thing in Romans 12:1 when Paul says, I urge you to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, pleasing to God. This offering takes place not in identified temples on Sunday morning, but in everyday life. In Colossians 3:17, exactly the same. Whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus. So there is a way of doing everything that's not in the name of the Lord Jesus, and there's also a way of doing everything that is in the name of the Lord Jesus. There's a way of doing everything that is to the glory of God, and a way of doing everything that is not to the glory of God. It's not the everything that changes, it's the purpose and the motivation and ultimately the end result. So in other words, your vocation is part of whatever you do. Your career is meant to be walked out in a sacrificial, holy, and pleasing God kind of way. Your job is part of God's works. I mean, think about preaching on John chapter 14 when Jesus says, you know what, if you remain in me and my words remain in you, you will ultimately have fruit that remains. What if that fruit that remains is the effect and the impact of your job? That there's a way of doing your job that will leave fruit that remains. That it's not just you'll witness to people and evangelize, and that's obviously good fruit also. But what if the good fruit is beyond that? And what I believe is that everyone talks about that God-shaped void in somebody's life. But I also believe there is a good-shaped void within us. You know, the God-shaped void can never be satisfied except by Christ, but there's a good-shaped void that isn't satisfied when we ignore the good works that He wants to do through us. So God is, the last part that I would say that kind of from my theology kind of fits into this developmental idea of God. God is a developmental God. You know, it should not just be businesses that are thinking about developing people. It should be churches that are thinking about how do we develop people. God is in the development process. But the cool thing, I think, is that when it comes to this intersection between faith and work, the work that you do is part of glorifying God, but the work that you do is also part of how God is developing you. So God gives us assignments. It's not just your boss at work. When God is a part of this, it's God giving you an assignment, and as you dive into that assignment and you have to depend upon Him, you're developed in the process. So God uses your work both to develop you and to be a part of leaving the fruit that remains that impacts the world. So that's why, I mean, goodness gracious, if we're not talking in the church, whether it's in sermon, it doesn't have to be in sermon series, but if we're not doing something in pockets to help people understand the value of work and the intersection of faith and work, then I just think we're really missing the boat. So the question you should ask yourself in your job, if you're a marketplace business person or a pastor, two great kind of work questions is, what is God doing in me, and what does God want to do through me? Here, now, in this place. How does God want to use my job to develop me? How does God want to use my job to leave fruit that remains? So we're going to get a little bit personal, and some of this is going to be, kind of Q&A back and forth between Dan and I, and some of it will give you an opportunity also to ask questions if you have questions as they come up. But Dan, why don't you come up, and Ralph shared a little bit of Dan's story, but I'll just have Dan kind of start by tell us a little bit about your faith journey, your vocational journey, as a CEO of Verizon Wireless. I think of two questions here, that helps us start to get at the intersection. How did you learn to work, and how did you learn to have faith?
Okay, very good. So learning to work, it was out of necessity. I wanted to go to college. Typical story, probably like many of you. I was the oldest of five, no money to do that, and first to go to college in my family. So, I've got that normal oldest of five, type A metabolism, and you can't help it. I mean, you've got it. So I just started working when I was 14, and I continued working. Well, it's a lot of years later now, but I just enjoyed it. I like working. I think about having left Verizon. I don't like to use the word retirement because I've challenged every pastor I've ever met. Is retirement in the Bible? No one has pointed it out yet. So it's what I think about.
It's called heaven.
There you go. I think about it. What are you going to do next? So that's kind of the journey I'm on. So I'm into a whole bunch of what are you going to do next things right now. Just being out of Verizon from last year after 37 years. In terms of faith journey, I grew up in the United Methodist Church. My great-grandfather was a founding member of the church. We had the red hymnals. Maybe some of you are I love the Methodist Church. So I grew up in that environment, and then when I went away to college, I kind of left church behind and lived this reckless life. But it was not a fulfilling life. And I met Wendy, who's sitting in the back. The more I speak, the farther away, the closer she gets to the door. I'm just thankful she came up here from State College with us today. When we were getting married, we recommitted our lives to Christ. And I was baptized in a Baptist General Conference church. And so one of the big driving things in faith was not only how we were going to live our lives, but taking on the responsibility of raising children. and how we're going to help influence their lives and what's important. Because we knew what was important when we were in our late teens and early 20s. We just ignored what was important. And we said, we don't want to live our lives that way. We want to do it differently. So as we were working to grow as Christians, we were church visitors. We've relocated 16 times. So what's the first thing you do? First thing you do is get the kids settled in school, and then you look at churches, family churches, Sunday school classes, stuff like that. So that was always really important to us over the years, and it became very fabric of our family and our lives and our commitment. So we have been blessed, just as Dan is a phenomenal pastor, we've been blessed with some really great churches. We've been through a couple of bad ones. But so I think the Lord worked in us and made us better and stronger and still continues to do that. So as the wireless industry was becoming a reality, when I got into the wireless industry, I was working in manufacturing in one of our predecessor companies in IT stuff, and I said, I think I want to get into this wireless thing, and my boss said, you would be crazy. That is never going to be a business, and it's never going to make any money, and can you spell failure? I said, well, yeah, but it just seems like maybe this will be something. So, I got into wireless when there were no wireless companies making any money. It was very fractured and all that, and you know the story now. Verizon has 115 million customers that pay their bills every month. And it's just become a great business. But in growing up with that business, I was growing spiritually too. I was getting the conviction that the way that I wanted to lead as I was asked to take on more responsibility was to be a servant leader. Because when you have people working for you or around you, you have responsibility for others. So the way that you conduct yourself is really important there. And what's the best measure of how you conduct yourself? How you conduct yourself in the really difficult times. It's easy to be good and consistent when things are going well, but what about when things are bad? What do you do? How do you handle that? Do you go to the Lord for your source of strength? Would you be willing to leave your company and make a move if you were asked to do things that were illegal or unethical? Would you have that strength? I was close to that a couple of times. That's how it all kind of came together. So
Dan, talk a little bit about how, you kind of started to get into it, but in that intersection between faith and church, how have churches helped strengthen your faith? How has faith kind of come alive in the marketplace, in your business? Where have those two things come together?
Yeah,
how do you live out your faith at work is part of that question as well.
At Verizon Wireless, we have 80,000 employees, so 80,000 families. And when you look at a population that size, it's a microcosm of our society. So everything that is going on in our society, good or bad, many people that are Christians and faithful and working in their communities and helping others, but many other bad things going on. Murders in our parking lots, domestic violence, unfortunately, so much more of that than we even talk about. Suicides in families. And these are your coworkers and your friends, and what can you do to help them? What can you do to help with their restoration? And, praying for people. Although there are some limitations, and I'll say that I was talking to some of you at the break, it is very hard in a big, rough company, and Verizon is a rough company. It's New York, New Jersey based, and everything you hear about that culture is true. We kind of talk about ourselves as having sharp elbows over there. So, and there is, there are a lot of things you can't do in a workplace like that, but you can be one-on-one friends with people, and you can help them out. And Wendy would get involved. You try to do what you can. You never feel like it's enough, but you know what's right. You know where the strength comes from, and you do the best that you can with it.
Yeah. So what are some of the places you kind of alluded to that with a statement? What were some of the places where it was the most difficult to live out your faith at work?
Yeah, some of the tougher ones were when you had, if you had a superior, and these were in the earlier days. This was even before Verizon Wireless, that you knew were maybe playing fast and loose with the books, and you just knew it wasn't right, and just said, I can't go along with this. I can't do this. We've got to do this differently. That's hard to do in a competitive, tough culture. One of the other things, and I thrive on competition. I mean, if people ask me what I miss about being at Verizon Wireless, I miss the stress of competition. I love the stress of competition. So I explained to Dan and some other guys at church once. I said I lived my work life, especially the last few years that I was CEO, in 15-minute increments. I'd be driving in. I'd have an hour and 15-minute commute into work. I would be on calls into work. I'd get in the office, and I would have meetings every 15 or 30 minutes. If you ever looked at my calendar, there were probably a dozen items on the calendar in a day. I'd take a break at lunch. I'd have prayer, and I'd read the Wall Street Journal for a half hour, and then I would be back at it until I was headed home, and then I was on calls headed home. That's a work life. So how do you make a difference in a high-pressure environment like that? And how do you treat your competitors? So one of the tougher things is how do you work in a competitive environment where you're trying to, this doesn't sound good in this seminar, but you try to beat your competitor. You try to beat the daylights out of your competitors. I used to say it with the highest level of integrity. You always want to win, but you never want to take shortcuts in how you do it. You never want to jeopardize your convictions with the Lord in how you do it. So in that environment, in that heat of battle, how do you conduct yourself? Do others in the industry, do they recognize that you're just trying to make a living for your employees as they are, and there's kind of a competitive but a mutual respect? So sometimes that's a little hard because it gets a little personal. And so that was one of the biggest challenges, but at the same time it was a challenge. I loved that. I mean, I like being in the middle of all that and trying to find ways to create value and employ families and have our folks be able to pay their mortgages and send their kids to college, all of those things.
So some of that kind of gets into, you and I have had some conversations, and I like the way you've put it, of developing, I mean, not as a marketing thing. We tend to think of it now today as a marketing thing, but kind of developing your own personal brand. And you've also talked about the shadow that you cast. So
yeah.
just talk a little bit about what was your brand, what did that mean to you at Verizon and the shadow and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense to you, your personal brand. When Dan was preparing his research, I talked about that for a little bit. And the longer that you're a pastor, or the longer that you're in a job, or if you own a company, the longer you're there, the more people you have coming to you for advice. And they think that you've got this. They think you've got this magic formula. When I announced my retirement, people were calling me and saying, "Okay, how did you do it?" A 22-year-old guy called me, just joined the company 6 months before. How do I get to be the CEO? So, I mean, where do you start with that? I said, you show up for work every day. You work as hard as the people around you. You make sure that you're helping others to develop, and things like that. But it's how you do things. And it's your personal brand is your reputation and how people think about you and how you want people to think about you. And I come back to this point. Your personal reputation is most developed in the difficult times. When something is going wrong, when there's a crisis in the company. Fortunately, I was gone by the time we got into all these data breaches and all this stuff. We didn't have that. But if you're running a public company, what is the worst day? When you show up on the front of the Wall Street Journal or in Bloomberg and something was wrong, the numbers weren't right, or people are questioning the very ethics of the company. Those are things that in how you deal in tough situations develops your personal brand. So when people think I've got some magic formula, and I don't have any, but I talk to them about how they're developing their career, how they're being known, what their work reputation is. Will they take on jobs that no one else wants to do? Will they move to locations? If you work for a large company, some of you do, I would suspect. Will you move to places no one else wants to move? Wendy and I moved to Bangor, Maine in 1980 for me to be a plant controller up there because no one would move to Bangor, Maine. I said, well, we'll go. And we did that. We did that several times, like the story when I left the manufacturing part of GTE, which is a predecessor of Verizon Company, and I said, I want to go to wireless, and my boss is saying this isn't going to be anything, but yeah, it might work out. So things like that, but it's hard to go against the tide sometimes. Yeah, I'll tell you something. I got a call one time. I was based in Chicago. I used to be up here in Minneapolis all the time because we had a regional headquarters that ran for Verizon Wireless that ran Minnesota, the Dakotas, Iowa, all that. And I was in the airport. I was just getting in a rental car in Chicago, and I got a call, and it was the chairman of our company. He said, "Hey, I've got this idea, and I want you to come do it." And I had just gotten the 15 states of the Midwest running like we wanted them to, and I said, I don't know if I want to do that. And I talked to another mentor of mine, and he said, "Never bet against the chairman," which I was old enough to know better than betting against the chairman. So I visited with him and said, "Sure." But there are those times. But my peers are saying, "Why are you doing this? What are you thinking?" In fact, I wasn't sure what we were doing. We moved to New Jersey at that time, and I told Wendy, I said, "Look, this could be one of those big corporate ideas that's never going to work out." This was 2005, by the way, just before we got into the recession. I said, I don't know if this is going to stick, or this is one of those short-lived corporate things, 18 months and it's gone. So let's not buy a house. Let's rent a house. So my son-in-law's parents had a house for rent, and we said, let's just stay here for a bit and see how this works out, and if this is a real job, or I'm going to be out looking at another company. And 10 years later, we still rented that same house. We never did buy a house. So anyway, those are just some of the things where you feel like you're pushing against the tide a little bit, but you think it's the right thing to do, and we would always pray about it. Wendy was always good and said, "Yeah, let's give it a shot. If it doesn't work out, we'll find something else to do."
So that was really, to kind of go back to the question, that was really kind of part of your brand. I'm willing to take on a new job, a new risk, and give this a shot, even if other people aren't willing to. Are there other things that you'd look at and say, this was also part of my reputation, my brand? Well,
maybe a couple of things. I had a conviction that you should never ask people on your team, in your group, to work harder than you work. You set an example of how hard to work, and always tried to do that. The other thing that I tried to do, I mean, I can be really decisive when I need to be, but I never liked the people calling me Mr. Mead and the whole hierarchy and all that from the old telephone company. So one of the things that I did, our headquarters was in New Jersey, but we had 1,800 stores around the country. You go in them, hopefully, or have been in them. And we have network people. You know, every town is our town because we have employees that work in about every town. I would tell the people in headquarters, there is no money made in headquarters. So, you know, kind of blood-sucking overhead here, folks. So get out of here and get out where the money is made. Get out where we take care of our customers in our stores. Get out in our call centers. So we had 35,000 people in stores, and you see them, sales and service people. We had another 30,000 people in call centers. We take around 15 million calls a month coming into our call centers. That's where you separate yourself from the competitors. So that was part of my brain, and my employees, I'm sure they got tired of hearing me say that. But I would go back to the same things, and then I would always, when I would be talking with a group of employees, you know, maybe a group this size or maybe a couple of thousand, what's the shadow that you cast? If you have others that work for you, what example are you setting? And that's part of your personal brand. What are you showing people? What example are you setting? And how do you influence the others around you? Are you going to be involved in gossiping about the business? Are you going to be whining? Are you going to be letting others carry your load? Or are you going to be a leader in your work group in terms of how you conduct yourself? It's part of your brand. It's part of the reputation that you get established. And then probably the best measure of your brand in leadership is if you want to progress through a company or a ministry, to not always be asking what the next job is. If you hire someone and they're with you for 6 months or 12 months and they say, okay, I've got this mastered, what am I going to do next? You probably want to say, find another job somewhere. What you want to be so well known and so good at what you do that the company is going to be asking you to do other things if you would like to do that before you're asking the company. So you're well known. The company has confidence in you, maybe more confidence than you have in yourself because of the results and the way that you conduct things. So that's how I talk to others about building their personal brand and building their reputation and the engagement with their families. I mean, this is a team sport. You know, being in corporate America, you've got to have family and friends with you or you're not going to be successful. So if things aren't right in your faith, if things aren't right at home, it's going to show up at work. And you've all probably seen that. You've seen it in the ministries, I would guess as well. So the kind of the well-rounded individual. So those are the few of the things that I think about and try to talk to others about.
So one of the things to kind of put into context, something that we do at Calvary, we don't call it developing your personal brand, but it's really that type of thing. How do you as an individual, and not just you as an individual, because all of you are here in roles, some kind of role of leadership, of influence. I mean, at Calvary we say that everybody's a leader. Because leadership is influence, and the Great Commission is that you would be a disciple maker, not just a disciple. So everybody is called by God to exercise influence, at least at one level, a one-on-one kind of level. I like to say, I don't believe that leaders are born or made, they're called. And until you experience what that calling is, there's this period of preparation. Part of the preparation is kind of that determining what is your personal brand, what are the values and the lessons in work and faith and the intersection that God has deposited in you that you're going to live with. So it's not just, sit down with somebody and look at a list of 20 or 30 values. It's really more personal than that. It's what are the lessons that God is deposited in your life. And He does that through the assignments that He gives you. One of the exercises that we've started doing, we've been doing for probably about 6 or 7 years at Calvary, picked it up from an organization called Leadership Breakthrough that has worked with Bobby Clinton material, which is very leadership developmental oriented. But we just do it's called a post-it note timeline, life mapping. It's really a way of figuring out your story, and as we lead people through that process, it starts by asking people. So just kind of brainstorm, get a Holy Spirit brainstorm going of who are the people, events, and circumstances that impacted you through your life. And so we lead people through a process of getting that all down on a sheet so you can kind of look at your story chronologically with who has impacted you. And then that goes to, okay, now all of those things that were hard, substitute the yellow post-it note for a pink post-it note. Pink equals pain. So what were the painful moments? Because so often, what God is depositing in us comes through the painful moments, and so often people don't process their pain to figure out what's the lesson that God is teaching me. What is He depositing in my life? And then from the pink post-it notes, it's okay, now look at all of them, and what were the turning points? What were the defining moments? What were the places that you say, that wasn't necessarily the biggest thing that ever happened to you. Some of my turning moments were little small things. But I look back and I say, that was a pretty key moment. And then it's out of all of that you just start distilling some of that stuff down, and you start saying, okay, in the circumstances, events, and people, what are the lessons, what are the perspectives, what are the truths that God really wants me to live out of? And they may not be the same. Your list of things may not be the same as Dan's or mine. Some of them may be common, might be held in common, but some of them could be really different. So how does your faith, how does God, that's what your faith is all about, shape those lessons that then get lived out in the workplace? So for me, when I look back, I'll just give you an example, one of my lessons that has shaped me in my workplace, which is church, but hasn't always been church. When I was a kid, we went to it wasn't a converged church. When I first started out in faith, it was an independent, kind of fundamental, somewhat legalistic Baptist church. And in a lot of ways, it was a really great experience for me. Other ways, it was just kind of weird. But one of the things that church did was they posted everybody's giving in the lobby at the end of the year, supposedly for tax purposes. But it was posted. But it wasn't posted by name, it was posted by number. So you could see how you compare to everybody else, but unless you got out your number, nobody could see, who was who. Well, one year as a kid, I was rummaging through my parents' bedroom dressers. I don't know if any of you did that as kids, but I just was always interested. What's in my parents' drawers? And I found their giving number. And so that year when that giving number was put up, I saw what they were making. Now, what I knew, not at that time, but what I knew later on, was that when I grew up, we were kind of borderline in South Dakota, borderline poverty level. I grew up in a 900 square foot house. We had 5 siblings and cousins that often lived with us, and it was 3 rooms on top of 3 rooms. And my dad was a hog farmer, and sometimes we made good money, and sometimes we barely got by. But what I remember about growing up was that I never, ever had any sense that we were poor. When I saw what my parents gave to the church, which was number 2 in this church, and I knew there were people who had more stuff, a lot more people who had a lot more stuff than we did. Man, that hit me. And I didn't realize it at the time, but God was beginning to deposit something in me about generosity. What I realized looking back as I kind of worked through that process myself was that the lesson was that generous people are never poor. That lesson on generosity has shaped me in my workplace. It shapes what I go after, it shapes how I live, it shapes how I've wanted Calvary to be. At Calvary, I often say to my staff, at Calvary, we're going to disadvantage ourselves on behalf of other churches in the community every chance we get. It comes out of that lessons that value that God deposited, that generous people, generous churches are never poor. God always responds to that. So, one of my challenges to you would be to identify, in whatever way, it doesn't have to be a post-it note timeline, but to develop in whatever way a clear sense of what are the lessons, that personal brand, what are the values that God specifically through circumstances, people, and events has been depositing in you, and how do you live that out in the workplace? That, to me, is one of the great ways that faith and work intersect. Let me ask kind of this question, and then I'll share some of what Calvary does, but how did your church, and we've kind of gotten around this, but maybe a little bit more to add to it or succinctly, but how did your church at those different intersections, so more recently Calvary, but before that other churches, how did your church help you live out your faith at work?
Okay. So as I mentioned, we visited and joined a lot of churches, got integrated in a lot of churches, and the thing for us was to be able to do it together and to get our kids settled into the right group of kids, and then us. So kind of the standing joke is we might have done it when we visited your church the first time. We always like being around young people, so we would say, "Hey, where's your young marrieds class?" Well, the last couple of churches, they looked at us and said, "No, you need to go to the geriatric section here." But we always wanted. We always liked the multiple generations and being around people like my grandparents or kids. So we did that, and that helped us get integrated in churches. The other thing that helped a lot was our kids. As you move around, you're always concerned about your kids in school and getting integrated in sports and church and all of that. Fortunately, our kids were good athletes when they were in middle school and high school, so they kind of got in a good group. By that time, we were able financially for them to go to Christian schools. We had moved so much, that was a point of stability. So we checked out the faith of the Christian schools, and they were able to go there, and they thrived in that environment. So as they were getting established, it helped us get to know other Christian parents and people. And we hosted a cell group. We call them life groups at our church now, but we hosted a cell group for years at our house, and then brought other adults together, and we would take turns or take different sections and lead the session. So those are just ways, and you're going through all these mergers and all this public stuff that we had going on, and that was just a point of great comfort to be able to have that infrastructure and have the Lord with you. So you knew you weren't doing it alone. So that's just kind of how it built.
So tell us a little bit about you've talked some about, and this isn't necessarily a way a church has informed your work life, but faith has informed your work life. You talked a little bit with me about Nehemiah being your favorite book, a mentor of sorts.
So one of the things the last few or many years is that I had pretty broad leadership responsibilities. I always like to start the month of January off reading Nehemiah, and I did it every year. And I'm doing it now. There's a guy, he's in our church somewhere around 40. He called me in July and said, "Dan, would you do a Bible study with me on Nehemiah? Just the two of us. And I know you travel all the time, but we can do it. If we're in the same town, we can do it face to face, or we can do it over the phone." So I said, sure, but I've used that. It's kind of my Old Testament hero, if you will. Nehemiah, the third guy in to rebuild the walls and rebuild the culture, and what he did physically and how he overcame Tobiah and Sanballat and all of those challenges he had. That was like kind of a normal day in my work life, and it just gave me great confidence. And then to see, as you got into chapters 9 through 13, to see how that comes to life in terms of the restoration of the people and how they honored God and how they celebrated. So that just became a roadmap for me for no good reason other than I just identified with it. I don't think I'd ever been through a Nehemiah study with anyone on that, but it was just something of interest, and now we're doing it again here.
I think that's another great application point. Some of you folks have done this. If you do it, you should be encouraging everybody in your church to do it. I think everybody should have a biblical mentor. I mean, in the leadership conversation, and that's what we're going to get in the second seminar, is just leveraging your leadership. How do we leave a legacy of leadership in those who are in our businesses or churches? But in that leadership conversation, almost everyone you talk to says, here's how we're trying to develop people, or here's how I was developed. The number one thing that I hear is the coaching, mentoring kind of deal. And to realize you don't have to have somebody who's living to be your mentor. I mean, that's why books are there. You should be steeping yourself in some of the great Christian biography. People like Helen Roosevelt and Amy Carmichael and Charles Spurgeon, whoever you want to kind of steep yourself in. But you should have a biblical mentor as well. At Calvary, we've started, with my staff, I've kind of made that a requirement. I want to know who your biblical mentor is, and then you spend time with that person through reading their stories and the scripture and figure out how does God use that to shape me. My biblical mentor is Moses, and man, I tell you, once I kind of figured that out, that has just been some rich study for me. So I really encourage you to do that as well. It's a way that your faith and work kind of integrate, because God will use that person and how he used that person to help you figure out how does God want to use me in my context, in my workplace. So the idea of having a biblical mentor. Let me just throw it out to all of you. What questions do you have for either one or both? You can feel free to direct all of them to Dan. I'm okay with that. But what questions do you guys have? The integration of faith and work. Yeah.
So, Business Dan, when you hear Pastor Dan communicating on work and worship and how your faith integrates, what is your reaction? Sometimes I wonder if I have a platform or if I'm dealt with a level of, in their mind at least, sarcasm of like, what do you know? I mean, what do you know about the business world? What do you know about day-to-day life in the factory? What do you know about trying to meet deadlines? What do you know about, because they may not believe that I understand their world, just as I think as pastors sometimes we don't believe people understand our world.
Sure.
And so how do we merge those two together to where there's this great trust level that I can empathize, I understand in that.
Well, I'm sorry, your first name, I can't.
Yeah,
Phil, yeah. I have my glasses on. So it ties into a little bit about what I was saying with your personal brand. I mean, my comments were kind of applying to the workplace, but if you think about your integrated personal brand, your personality, your spiritual life, your work life, one of the keys to long-term success is surrounding yourself with people better than you in each of the different areas. So in my work, I'm not an engineer by training, but I've run big engineering and wireless network organizations. And I understand good parts of the law, but I'm not legally trained. But I knew that I needed people stronger than me around me in each of those areas. Someone asked about me a few years ago, why are his teams always successful? And a mentor, I heard about this after the fact, a mentor said, Dan is great at surrounding himself with people better than him in each of those areas. And I try to do that spiritually. I'll never be anywhere close to where Dan Nold is spiritually and most of my other pastors. So, we have a lot of interchange. And, Dan asked me because of my leadership experience, and we'll talk about this in developing leaders and continuity and that. I mean, he asked me, what I think about things related to that. So I think we have this mutual respect where we're stronger together in those areas, and there's not really a divide. And there are many other business people in our church, really talented, a great generation of business leaders coming up through our church that I'm getting to know a little bit now. And that's encouraging. So we kind of look at, what life is like in the other's world. I mean, I am just crazy type A, and by nature, I'm a problem solver. So don't tell me how you feel about something, because I'm going to want to fix it, right? I mean, that's the way I am. And, Wendy and I have kind of worked through that over the years. Now I listen for 2 minutes, and then I try to fix it. But when I look at the church and the church organization and what's going on, if Dan brings something into my attention, I say, well, we can fix that. We can do that. Here's how we do it. Here's the people that we get involved in all those things. And what I'm learning, I need a little more discernment before I do that. So I think it's as we're getting more acquainted, and Wendy and I are getting deeper involved with our church congregation, we're finding our way there a little bit.
Great question.
I have one in the back here.
Thanks for coming. Business Dan, I guess that's how we're going to.
You can call him Reverend Dan. He likes that.
You mentioned working for a large organization, and I work for Cargill, which is a large organization, and we have started a Faith at Work group, and we're running into roadblocks that a large organization that is afraid of that type of organization or that type of group in its midst, and not allowing the communication, not allowing our ability to reach people with that message. How is there anything that you would say that you could help us? How do we get the organization comfortable of bringing in a Faith at Work group? And
that's a really important question. I anticipated, and I don't think I or we as a company have done a great job of that. Because here's the reality. It gets a little back to my microcosm comment. So we had 17 special interest clubs, if you will, within the organization, and everyone could have a club. And you know the names of all of them, and they all needed to have equal rights, and there were very diverse lifestyles to ethnic groups and to people that were dealing with certain disabilities, all of those things. And we allowed those to go on, but the corporation, if you will, stayed a step removed and didn't really sponsor them and didn't really disallow them unless they were getting into violent areas in that. I know there were Bible studies going on around different areas. I was always fine with that. It was always it was the self-start things where you get a group of people together. It wasn't a corporate top-down sanctioned initiative. And you let those go on, and you hope certain ones will flourish, and the other ones that aren't justified normally fall by the wayside. So that's how we dealt with it. But probably the same issues you're dealing with in Cargill is the way that we dealt with it. We had in our work area, particularly over in New York, New Jersey, we had a very large Jewish population in our workforce. Many of the leaders of our company are part of the Jewish faith. So we had great diversity, but I don't have a great path to tell you how to bring the Bible studies and the focused on Christianity above, to rise above the other things going on there. Got to have some more questions.
Other questions? Yeah.
Can you share a little bit more about your sense of how churches can better empower their people, not so much to just go share the gospel in their workplaces, but to be the kind of people, and maybe one of the ways to come at this is, how are churches unhelpful in not promoting a faith and work connection, how in closing that Sunday to Monday gap from your perspective?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. A lot of the churches, in the early years when we were growing up, church was Sunday morning, and then Sunday school either before or after it, and then you were done, and you said grace at dinner, and then your week went on wide open until it was time for church again. Taking that wall down and integrating a lot more into your Monday through Friday. And that's hard. That's still hard for me, by the way, because I'm so used to, the old world and the momentum of the world, and some of the things that I've been talking about. I think the other thing is to break down the hierarchy of the church. We talked about this a little bit ago, but the hierarchy of, you kind of have the lay people here. You might have the youth minister, a couple of associate pastors, maybe the business pastor. You have the lead pastor. You might have a district superintendent somewhere in the mix. And if you were a missionary, wow, you got to be in the front of the line at the potlucks, right? That was that was a big deal. And tearing that hierarchy down, one of the things that we're working on, that Dan and myself and 10 other people are working on, is what does leadership look like in the church? And we've got this one woman in our group. She is a phenomenal leader in the church. And in one of our meetings, she said, "I'm not really a leader. I'm just a stay-at-home mom." And I said, "No, you're missing it. You've got the most important responsibility on this team because of what you're doing, not only for your family and your kids, but what you're doing for so many others." It's breaking that down and making sure that everyone, you don't need a title to be a leader, right? The shadow you cast isn't dependent on your job title, whether it's in the secular world or whether it's in church. It's who you are and how you treat others and how others look to you for support. So that's one of the things we've been in a lot of churches, as I said. I think that's one of the things that we need to change. We need to change that thinking.
I think one of the things that we've done at Calvary, I think, decently along those lines is, I think we have, tried to break down some of those walls. We feel like part of our goal is not just producing leaders for Calvary, but producing leaders for every area of life. So that's part of our goal. So like this last week, we had a coaching skills training deal. Half the people that were there were gaining coaching skills for their business, for their marketplace kind of deal, not because we're raising up just a coaching program at Calvary. So we want to do as many things like that we can that cross over, that don't have the walls. And I think, one of the things I shared earlier is, I think the other part that churches and leadership in churches don't do well, kind of miss the boat, is when we narrow kind of our stewardship, our sense of ownership and responsibility, when that's too narrow, And I think that really my ownership and responsibility is the four walls of the church. And that's what God is going to hold me accountable to. I think if we can broaden that so that we say, no, God has called me to this city to help pastor this city, then all of a sudden church looks different. Because now of course I want to help you succeed in the work world because this is my community. I'm pastoring the community. When you live as a tzaddikim, a righteous one in the workplace, that affects our whole community. So now my responsibility is broader, and it kind of releases me to say, well, we're just as important to us to figure out how to help you lead in your neighborhood and in your workplace as it is, who's leading our kids ministry, that kind of thing.
If I could add one more comment to wrap that up. I think in our church has gotten really good at this, but asking business leaders for more than, we haven't talked about money yet, which surprises me. Asking business leaders for more than money, asking for their engagement in asking them for money is fine. I mean, you got to do that. Hopefully it's their heart that causes the money to flow to the church and the Christian organizations. But understanding what business leaders can add, and because many of them want to plug in and just don't know how to do it because they've been on this rat race, and helping them understand the value proposition, the needs of the church, as well as where their skills and assets could help out. So.
Yeah, I hit that early on at Calvary. So I came to Calvary, I was about 30, 31, and there were some really good leaders in the church even then, but not necessarily plugged into the church. And as I went around as kind of a new pastor saying, hey, love to see you involved in Calvary, the typical answer that I got was something like, I don't sing, I can't be around kids for more than 15 minutes at a time unless they're my own. So I really don't know where I would plug in. And I just, we'll talk in the second session, we'll talk a little bit about some of the programs and strategies that we do at Calvary. But honestly, it's more about the culture than it is about the program. If you have a culture where, like Dan is saying, you appreciate people for what they bring to the table, not just the money or not just the, whatever, that culture begins to be attractive to leaders. If you have a culture that says, we want you to lead, what do you want to do? One of the things that we say at Calvary is that we don't believe that God brought you here so that you could help us fulfill, our vision at Calvary. We believe that God brought you here so that Calvary can help you fulfill God's vision for you, God's dreams for you. So it just, I think that kind of culture begins to be attractive to people because they say, you value us for what we bring to the table, not just the pocketbook. I've practiced. Nobody has ever asked me this question, but I've actually practiced it in my head. That if somebody like Dan or one of the key leaders in our business leaders in our church, in our congregation, came to me and said, "Okay, Dan, you can have either my money or you can have me. Which do you want?" and it's always you. God, you are the resource that God has put here. That's far more. I mean, I often, and I know this kind of bothers some people, but I'll every once in a while buy a lottery ticket, just in case God wants to fund the church that way. I want to be open to whatever God is doing. And I always tell God whenever I do it, God, you get 90%, and I'll take 10%, you get 90%. And every time God's response has been, Dan, if money was all you needed, I would give you all the money that you need. But that's not the issue. So that always causes me to look beyond and say, okay, so what is the issue? It's not money. So money really is pretty easy for God to resource when a church, I believe, is ready for it. Really what we're doing is we're working with people. Glenn, and then...
Sure. The two of you sitting up there is an interesting juxtaposition because I believe that that what Verizon is a part of is a change of the mission field for the church. Honestly, you say you're in a church without walls. Actually, we live in a world without walls.
Yeah.
The world comes with everyone right here in my Verizon it's not AT&T, it's a Verizon Apple iPhone. I'm bringing the world in my pocket. And as you're preaching, each Sunday, Dan, up there, you're preaching and you see people pull out their phone and you don't know if they're taking notes or sending a text message to someone, or maybe just Googling some topic you mentioned that maybe they want to learn more about, and they go off, on the internet discovering new worlds while you're trying to make a point, and so I think it's interesting because, and I'd like you to comment on this a little bit. I wonder, how have there's two things really. How has this mobile revolution changed your understanding of your mission field, Dan? And then secondly, how have business leaders informed your understanding of the church's mission?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'll take the second part first. I shared earlier. I think one of the ways that the business leader has shaped my understanding of church is when I started thinking about my parish as my city, not just my congregation. What I started realizing was that I believe that God draws the people that He needs, to impact the city or impact the church, or He's always providing resources. So for me, one of the initial places where that impacted my thinking and perspective was that realization that it's not necessarily the case that every pastor is a great leader, and it's not every great leader in the kingdom, and it's not necessarily the case that every great leader in the kingdom is a pastor. So it really kind of broadened and said, if we want to impact the city, there are other leaders that God has brought, other resources He's brought to this city, and we got to find out a way to work together and not just have it be, even when we do unity stuff in our community, not just have it be the pastor's club. And so that's one place. A second place is just really practical. I mean, Dan has really, and other leaders as well, but Dan has really helped to shape my thinking on what does it look like to leverage our leadership at Calvary. How do we build leaders? A real simple case in point, is that I have typically thought in terms at Calvary that I just want to develop leaders. I don't care where they go. I want to help develop leaders. They're going to go out and impact the world. I think that's part of the redemptive purpose of our community. And so it's just kind of this general, development of leaders. Well, as we've kind of gone through a strategic planning process, Dan has said, hey, you really need to think about succession and continuity in your own organization too. So how are you developing leaders for specific roles as well, which is, a legitimate part of the development process. So I like to think, there's nothing wrong with churches running more like businesses in terms of we can lead from them. And there's also nothing wrong with businesses running more like churches, in the sense that we can help. And that I think is part of the intersection. In terms of the first question, how has the mobilization, that kind of revolution impacted me? It's more, in a sense, ironic than you think, the two of us up here, because Dan is former president of Verizon Wireless, and I got rid of my phone like 9 months ago, so I've been without a phone. I think that revolution has so impacted our world that there's a point at which we need to kind of step. It's like any other tool. There's a point at which we need to step back and say, what are the best uses of this tool, and what are the ways in which our culture is getting impacted by this tool in other ways. Honestly, there's a growing group of people who are recognizing, not just with phones, but the whole, like Justin said, you spend about 100,000 hours at work, which is just a little bit less than people are spending on Facebook. It's shaping the heck out of our world in good ways and bad. So. Positively, we do a lot of work in Myanmar. I talk, and we're doing it through national leaders there, not our own people. I talk to those leaders 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes by Facebook chat, sometimes by Hangout video. Sometimes, my goodness, it's revolutionized the way that we do our work in Myanmar. It's revolutionized their work. We're the first ones that brought them cell phones. We brought them old Apples, and they're on their cell phones, sometimes just like us, too much. But it has revolutionized that. And then, just the ability to impact broader. I kind of got a little bit of a kick out. I don't even know if they still do it, but in my mind I say they keep doing it. But Dan's kids have a mission in Laos, and at least at some points they've listened to, our messages, our streaming in Laos. So it's kind of fun to know that there's some impact that you can have at a broad level. That's really important. So why miss that? You can't.
Yeah, there's
let it go.
Thinking about our industry and being part of it here, there's a real dichotomy. So you think about our kids and grandkids in Laos and being able to FaceTime with them 2 or 3 times a week and talk with them over the Lao, the communist government's broadband.
Right.
Okay, that's pretty cool. But then the unintended consequences of the success of the technology, I don't know if you read it over the weekend, but people check their handheld device on the average of 80 times a day. I mean, we've probably been doing it here. I shut mine off so I wouldn't do it when I'm sitting up here. But it is consuming everything. I was talking with someone, it might have been John, we were talking at the break, and I said, it's just unbelievable how all of this has developed and happened. And it's, I remember in 2002, we were trying to find a new revenue stream for wireless. And we said, there's this thing called text messaging. And we were wringing our hands, is this going to be a business? And we were putting promotions together, and we were packaging it with other plans. And it was just explosive, because people wanted to communicate but didn't want to talk to each other. So you go from those humble beginnings, and now Verizon Wireless processes 70 billion text messages a month just on our networks. So that's a big deal. The last thing that I'll mention, during the recession, 2008 and 2009, we remember the unemployment rates were in double digits. And we as a company were really worried, because we're a recurring revenue business, and people paying their bills is important to the success and the reinvestment of our company. And we were worried that the bad debt was going to go through the roof, like it happened in the auto industry and it happens in the mortgage industry. It never happened in wireless. We never saw a blip in the bad debt rates. People would not pay their utilities. This is not all good, by the way. Wouldn't buy food, but they wouldn't lose control of their social network with their device. And that was, 9 years ago? And it's only gotten more intense now with video, consumption of video, the iPhone all over the place on all the carrier networks. But that was like a light bulb to me, because I'm watching those trends closely. That was a light bulb going on, saying, wow, this has really changed the social norms in how this is used.
I think one of the places where that also affects, when you're talking about that, Dan, I think Google and Verizon Wireless and all this, the mobile revolution has made us near godlike in omniscience. Okay, I'm exaggerating, but you understand what I'm saying. You want to know something, you just Google it. You just you look online, you look on Facebook, whatever. But what we've grown less adept at in our culture is wisdom. Knowledge is at a fingertip in a second, and wisdom is hard to come by. And if you want to talk about, so what is the role of the church in that culture? The church needs to see itself as a refinery of wisdom. We need to help people take lots of information, and even need to help people understand that you don't need all the information you think you need, and how do you distill it down into wisdom and life principles and stuff like that. And I think that in the mobile deal we can talk about, well, how do we take advantage of it? But there's also this calling to say, in this culture where people want to communicate but don't want to talk, can find all sorts of information, how do we become the leading refinery of wisdom in our culture. And I think we're
It's
15
time
minutes
for a
past
break, yes.
our break,
But
so-
we're good on that.
Okay.
So Pastor Dan and Business Dan, you get to take a little break.
Great. Thank you.
We're going to take a break for about 15 minutes, but before we do that, I just wanted to share a couple of announcements.